Thank you for coming. I'm going to present our keynote speaker and our two respondents, and then I'll completely cede the floor to their conversation. So our keynote speaker, with whom those of you who've been here today are already familiar, is Alfred López. He's professor of English and Comparative Literature at Purdue University, and he's the author of 4 books. Most recently, José Martí, A Revolutionary Life from 2014, which has been hailed as a definitive Martí biography. His essays have appeared in venues such as American Literature, Comparative Literature, Cuban Studies, and South Atlantic Quarterly, among other journals, and he's also contributed to the Huffington Post. He was a founding editor of the journal, The Global South, a leading journal of globalization studies, and also my predecessor at a post at the University of Mississippi. Finally, his translation of Martí's Nuestra América, or Our America, appears in the current edition of the Norton Anthology of American Literature. His title today, the title for the keynote, is Questions of Intention and Method in Global South Studies. Our two respondents today are, first, Rosemary Jolly, who is the Vice Chair of the Humanities in Literature and Human Rights and Professor of Comparative Literature here at Penn State, where she also holds appointments, and this will be a long list, in the Department of English, the Law Ethics Institute, the Bioethics Program, African Studies, and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. Her publications include the books, Cultured Violence, Narrative, Social Suffering, and Engendering Human Rights in Contemporary South Africa, and Colonization, Violence, and Narration, as well as many, many articles, most notably for the purposes of this conference perhaps, a piece in the inaugural issue of the journal The Global South, which Al edited, titled For Northern Displacements, Understanding the Meaning of Madness in Global Constructions of AIDS. Our second respondents will be Cynthia Young, who is a department head in African American Studies. Again, there's a lot of titles here. Interim co-director of the Africana Research Center and associate professor of African American Studies and English here at Penn State. She's the author of Soul Power, Culture, Radicalism, and the Making of the U.S. Third World Left, which looks at the influence of Third World anti-colonialism on activists, writers, and filmmakers of color in the U.S. in the 1960s and 1970s. Her essays and articles have also appeared in venues such as American Quarterly, New Labor Forum, Disposition, American Literature, Cinema Journal, and the Journal of Visual Culture. Her current book project, from which I saw her present a piece at an institute last summer, is Terror Wars, Culture Wars, Race, Popular Culture, and the Civil Rights Legacy After 9/11, which considers the contours of popular culture and contemporary discourse in the wake of the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon.
Thank you very much. I am, you know, it is a typical thing for a lecturer to get up and thank everyone and tell them that they're glad to be here. But I'm really, really thrilled that this event is here and that there's so many people in this room that, what is it?
We can't hear you.
You can't, okay. Project, okay.
Project.
Thank you. Use the smaller room. Okay. No, but I'm absolutely thrilled that this gathering exists, and there are so many people in this room whose work I followed and that I wanted to meet, and so it's a wonderful opportunity. The talk that I have for you today, coming from a rather dry title, but there is, for me, this gathering and this moment puts me in mind of our time under the banner of the Global South, heading of Global South Studies. It's a heading that, as I'll get to in the talk, isn't really all that old. And a lot of the thinking I've been doing has been about not parallel moments, because we're not following a template of any sort, but moments in of previous disciplinary dispensations, and you know, what did post-colonial studies look like a decade into it before it was even calling itself post-colonial studies? What sorts of conversations went on? And one particular event that has been in my head was long ago. A colleague of mine at Purdue was actually one of the graduate students in attendance at the 1983 Unit for Criticism and Interpretive Theory conference at Illinois, where Gayatri Spivak gave the first iteration of that paper. right, canvas of alter and speed. I'm not suggesting that people will think we're that cool in 30 years, but, or maybe they will, who knows? But I see this as a sort of formative, potentially, right? Potentially formative moment in which we get to, you know, take stock and think of not just what we do, but how we do it, and what those choices entail, right? So, I'm going to begin with, I'll read a little bit and talk a little bit as the occasion allows. I'm going to start with 3 epigraphs, brief ones. First, Edward Said from a very old book called Beginnings, back in 1975. Beginnings, Intention, and Method. The epigraph reads, "The beginning, then, is the first step in the intentional production of meaning." Second epigraph, from Jacques Derrida's White Mythology. "Metaphysics, the white mythology which reassembles and reflects the culture of the West. The white man takes his own mythology, Indo-European mythology, his own logos, that is, the mythos of his idiom, for the universal form of that he must still wish to call reason, which does not go uncontested." And the third, from an old Paul Simon song called "The Cool, Cool River." "For the mother's restless son, who says, 'Hard times, I'm used to them. The speeding planet burns, I'm used to that. My life's so common, it disappears.'" So these epigraphs that open my talk roughly correspond to 3 sections, a couple of sets of questions, and a very provisional hypothesis at the end that collectively attempt to frame the present state of what we're starting to call global South studies. I use that phrase with some trepidation. I don't know how timely or untimely that phrase is yet. So I first want to offer a broad conceptual set of questions about the act of beginning as a conscious setting to work, one that simultaneously enables and delimits the field of play. Said's point, as we'll see, has much to tell us about the play between intention and method that from the beginning sets epistemological parameters for an object of study, which in turn narrows the range of more or less useful methods of knowing that object. So I'm well aware that object and knowing, knowledge, are quite loaded terms for many of us in this room. I invoked them here precisely because the various disciplines that inform our own methods have, more or less well-intentionedly, functioned under the assumed stability of both an object of study and the possibility of knowing it. We might think here of the old Hegelian Afterbund with all its contradictory meanings, right? To capture, to overtake, to cancel, to abolish, but also to pick up and overtake. So the second part of my talk will bring Said's frame of beginnings to bear upon a couple of disciplinary methods that have shown, for me, a great deal of promise, viability as tools, techne, tools for scholarship of the Global South. And I want to emphasize, I've chosen these the 2 texts that I want to say a few things about: Vijay Prasad's The Poor Nations and John Komarov's Theory of the South, not because I'm privileging them in any particular way, but because they embody certain directions and certain headings that I've seen developing that we might think about, both in isolation and comparative. So I offer these examples as a way of revealing both the possibilities and the challenges we face as a self-described interdisciplinary field. For if interdisciplinarity, as my PhD mentor Herman Rappaport once put it, means assuming responsibility for more than one field, it also necessitates working with or among more than one method. So I'm going to skip a little bit here. In my closing remarks, I will offer what I hope will be some useful benchmarks for a more intersubjective and perhaps more truly global and southern interdisciplinarity for global South studies, one that will not necessarily transcend the respective strengths and limitations of its various methods, but which may enable a clearer understanding of, and hopefully a more mindful relationship with, the vast majority of the world's populations for and about and alongside of which we would speak. So, back to Said. Said's once famous, now I suspect forgotten, axiom about beginnings from one of his earliest works. This is his second book. This is before Orientalism. This is before anyone is even thinking about something called post-colonial studies. So his whole axiom about beginnings and intentions may strike some of us as a counterintuitive choice, given that we are here to talk to each other about a body of work that is already in its second decade. Yet it is only within the last 5 years or so that the phrase Global South Studies has circulated at all. See, for example, the 2017 rechristening of the Association of Third World Studies as the Association of Global South Studies, and the launch in 2015 of something called the Journal of Global South Studies. Jordan. More to our purpose, in the decade plus of Global South's history as a journal, I see very little direct attention to anything resembling questions of method. Instead, the journal spent much of its first decade defining and refining, and often expanding, its epistemic reach. Issues during its first 4 years encompassed territories ranging from Africa and Latin America to the US South and the Pacific Rim to India and the Caribbean. Only since 2011 do we begin to glimpse somewhat in issues such as Walter Mignola's and Caroline Levander's The Global South and World Disorder, and Magalia Mias Teixeira's absolutely admirable special issue Dislocations. We see in those numbers of the Global South the turn towards a meta-discursive method. Strangely enough, there's a 2014 issue of the Global South called New Media Technologies in the Global South, which, if you run a keyword search, the word method doesn't even, methodology doesn't even appear in it, whatever. Anyways, thus, after a decade of collectively testing the epistemological boundaries of the Global South, we now stand at the beginning of our interactions with these questions of method to assume the mantle of codifying one or more methodologies and, most crucially, passing it on to graduate students who will in turn take responsibility for its next iteration. But is this task as straightforward as Said's seemingly casual model? Beginning plus intention equals method. What was axiomatic for a young Said in 1975, that in the beginning we can always retroactively read intention, consciously stated or not, when we set it out, has already grown more complex by the time he writes a new preface to the same book 10 years later. This is the Morningside edition of Beginnings from 1985, where he writes, quote, the positive attitude that literature, history, philosophy, and social discourse, and indeed most of the modes of writing about men and women in history are in fact tangled up together, that they're often separated on professional, even epistemological grounds in order to accomplish social goals of one sort or another, and that criticism, if it is to be criticism, deals with the separations, the entanglements, the consequences. End of quote. So, even this retrospective reading of intention and method as a multidisciplinary question doesn't really anticipate the kinds of interdisciplinary entanglements that are already defining Global South Studies. In the context of Said's description, we can actually read our project as a re-entanglement of intentions and methods that a previous disciplinary dispensation had, to go back to his quote, separated on professional, even epistemological grounds, end quote, for its own social or intellectual or political ends. I've dwelt thus far in Said's Beginnings, a book seldom cited nowadays even by post-colonialists, to draw a contrast between this early work, thoroughly a product of Said's early orientation as more or less mainstream comparatist, and the career arc through which we can retroactively trace a genealogy of interdisciplinary entanglements that lead to all the works that we know now, Orientalism, Culture and Imperialism, his later writings on Palestine, and other works that defined, right, helped define the field of post-colonial studies. Because it was only retroactively, over a decade after the publication of Orientalism, that scholars enshrined it, in other Said writings, into a field that can only be said to have arrived, in air quotes, with the publication in 1995 of the first edition of Ashcroft Griffith Tiffin's Post-Colonial Studies Reader. So there's a time arc here in a genealogy that I think it's important for us to keep in perspective. In Beginnings itself, we can catch only glimpses of what we might identify as an intention that informs a method, which in turn, in which we might read in turn, again retroactively, something we call post-colonial. In this early book, we already see both the young Said's disciplinary grounding as a Europe-centered, if not Eurocentric, comparatist, and flashes of a more interdisciplinary entanglement with literary theory. He talks about Paul de Man, continental theory, interest in Foucault and Jean-Baptiste Vico, and the history of Arabic writings, the whole section in there on the Arabian Nights. It is thus more than a little presciently that the young Said claims in beginnings that intention, quote, is a notion that includes everything that later develops out of it, no matter how eccentric the development or inconsistent the result, end of quote. More directly relevant for us is Said's further stipulation, quote, that intention is never inconsistent with method, though it may appear to be frequently at odds with it, close quote. It is precisely this tension between intention and method, between the individual scholar's idiosyncratic view and the burgeoning field's communal concern, that characterizes in one way or another the examples of Global South scholarship, to which I will turn next. Of course, Said's opposition between the individual and the collective deconstructs itself pretty obviously. It wouldn't be difficult to demonstrate the ways in which these two categories permeate and in fact define each other. Yet their recurrence also attests to their efficacy as a heuristic, as a tool, by which we can highlight our questions of method, right? Because it is to questions of the individual scholar making more or less conscious choices from among a range of disciplinary methods, and doing so under the purview of some communal concern, though not necessarily of the future community that might retroactively adopt it, that we now turn. I had none of these questions in mind 12 years ago when I founded the journal The Global South. The journal's title asserts only an object of study, or at least an epistemic break from what had to that point been a settled object of study. I refer here, of course, to the postcolonial, which had itself emerged as a revisionary epistemology of what had previously been Commonwealth or Third World studies. That postcolonial studies as a field had never resolved into anything resembling an orthodox methodology gave me even less reason to consider it in my brief introduction to the first issue of the journal. So it's almost by accident, really, that in defining the journal's intellectual focus, my introduction offers a few fleeting hints, not conscious, I assure you, toward a method in the new project's asserted difference from its intellectual predecessor. So I'm trying to think at this point, how do I distinguish this thing called the Global South from this established body of work, postcolonial. So in the interest of time, I'll just briefly cite a couple of quick passages here, which were the best I could do at the time. First, quote, it's very weird to quote myself in front of me. First, quote, the Global South diverges from the postcolonial in that it is best glimpsed at those moments where globalization as a hegemonic discourse stumbles, where the latter experiences a crisis or setback. So then, a quick inventory of setbacks follows in that essay, and we could probably make our own list here, think of the kinds of disturbances to the forest, you might say, that hit neoliberal globalization starting in the 1990s, financial crises in Russia and Brazil, at the time, the current infrastructural meltdowns in Iraq, the Iraq War, Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, the unraveling of the Celtic Tiger in 2008 hadn't happened yet, so I didn't write about that. So this first passage proposes a way of historicizing recent events so as to foreground neoliberalism's global failures or global setbacks. As a post-colonialist trained in literature and literary theory, my methodological instincts led to an application of an oppositional political economy and correspondingly to a historicized subaltern subject, to narrative fiction such as Mohsin Hamid's novels, for example, or Roberto Bolaño's epic novel 2666. So the second little quotation from that essay, and which is, I think, one that has had a lot of, that seems to be more at play here at this conference, quote, nor is the Global South as a signpost of globalization's discontents limited to geographical regions outside of North America and Western Europe, end quote. So that the Global South ceases to be a geographical descriptor and can and does encompass minority populations in global North locations. So Caribbean diasporas in Toronto, the North African exurbs of Paris, white Quebecois, white Afrikaners in South Florida, and so on. This suggests a method that abandons the literary regionalisms of my own post-colonial training for a more comparative reading of subaltern subjects, not merely relative to a majority culture, but occupying their own agentic space within it. Recent narrative fictions that lend themselves to just such a reading include Mohsin Hamed's How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia, or Karan Mahajan's The Association of Small Bombs, or Aravinda Diga's White Tiger, and of course much of Zadie Smith's work. Read in retrospect, I find that these and other such moments from my long ago introduction suggest the possibility of a method stemming from, first, the recognition of neoliberal globalization as an epistemic break from the post-colonial, and second, the comparative nature of studying anything as geographically unmoored as the Global South. But of course in 2007 that method could only be, in Said's terms, idiosyncratic. I had no real sense of the communal concern that today defines what we are starting to call Global South studies. If you had told me in 2007, sitting at my computer at Ole Miss, that there was going to be a bunch of people at a major university 12 years later discussing the Global South, I would have just thought that was screamingly funny, that this would grow into what it has become. This too is a moment that the young Said envisions and beginnings, albeit somewhat vaguely, in the assertion of, quote, a necessary certainty, a genetic optimism that continuity is possible as intended by the act of beginning, which presupposes in his terms is really anterior to any explicit search for a method, so that the question of a method actually comes out of an untutored belief, an unguided optimism that there is something to be gleaned by that method. That there is a sense of, that there's a sense of a future there at stake, even before the conversation about method even surfaces. Which is a remarkable thing for a young Said who'd been thinking about in 1975. So, scholarship from the past decade that has variously laid claim to Global South studies, from the neo-Marxist historicism of Vijay Prashad's The Poor Nations to the eccentric, I'm not calling them weird, eccentric anthropology of Jean and John Komaroff's theory from the South, has operated in a space perhaps more defined by the communal, but nevertheless still dependent on the particular disciplinary intentions that inform the author's respective methods. Both of these important texts merit more attention than I can obviously give them here. For now, I can nevertheless point to key moments in each that arguably reveal something of a shared intention, to stick with Said's terms, along with methods that offer divergent paths and illuminate different facets of that communal concern. So, in the introduction to The Poor Nations, Prashad offers this important definition of the Global South, precisely in the language of historicized resistance. And this is out of Prashad's introduction. Quote, the Global South has come to refer to this concatenation of protests against the theft of the commons, against the theft of human dignity and rights, against the undermining of democratic institutions and the promises of modernity. The Global South is this, a world of protest, a whirlwind of creative activity. These protests have produced an opening that has no easily definable political direction. End of quote. If we accept Said's axiom, we can read Prashad's opening definition as a statement signaling both intention and method. The Global South is a collective activity of negation, of protest. Yet it remains, as he keeps writing, a creative activity lacking, quote, an easily definable political direction. In short, lacking methodology. The rest of Prashad's introduction very clearly articulates just what kind of orientation a Global South methodology, in his view, ought to have. Quote, the system's problems are not technical, nor are they cultural. They are social problems that require political solutions, end quote. Leaving aside for now the problem of parsing cultural from social and political, and this is the problematic residue, I think, of an earlier Marxist methodology of base and superstructure, but we can have that conversation later. Prashad ends the same paragraph with this very apt description of the Global South as a plurality of methods that do not conform to a single methodology. Quote, the Global South is a place, it's not a place, but we'll just go with that. The Global South is a place of great struggle, of various tactics and strategies experimented with on the streets and in the halls of government. It is an unfinished story, one that has to have a good ending, end quote. Prashad's introduction thus provides a very clear statement of intention and method, what the Global South is, and what, according to one very influential neo-Marxist historian, it ought to be. This opening intention and method operate quite consistently throughout the poorer nations, most notably in its insistence on historicizing neoliberal globalization through a macroeconomic lens. The view throughout is from the perch of institutional bodies and multinational coalitions negotiating global treaties that generate tectonic shifts beneath the feet of untold masses. Prashad acknowledges culture only fleetingly, and I suspect grudgingly. For example, in passing references to, quote, the rhetoric of Asian values which appeal to Malaysian elites, unquote, or the Islamism that accompanies, quote, a call for Malaysians to become a nation of workaholics, end quote. The cultural changes that at least inform economic reforms, which the latter arguably cannot do without, add an important dimension to any study of neoliberalization anywhere in the world. Prashad sees this dimension, but doesn't adequately unpack it within the self-imposed limitations of his method. Read in this context, South-South cooperation isn't just about, quote, social problems that require political solutions, end quote, but they're always already imbricated with culture and language, and specifically informed by colonial histories and discourses that Prasad's singular focus on institutional political economy can glimpse, but not really address. Similarly, a political economy orientation, also informed by relevant histories of language and discourse, would be more attuned to the linguistic shell game of terms such as emerging markets, development, modernization, terms which Prasad offers glimpses, without narrating them into a larger history of the language of coloniality and modernity that have never gone away. Colonialism, post-colonialism, and now globalization as one long con. Jean and John Komaroff's theory from the South affords just such a meta-narrative, not from a linguistic or literary disciplinary perspective, but from a philosophical and anthropological one. The Komaroff's work is much more explicitly interdisciplinary than Prashad's. Its introduction works through a genealogy of philosophers and post-colonial theorists before presenting readers with its own ethnographic methodology. Theory from the South's interdisciplinarity is not a singular event, but part of a recent emergence of scholars taking up a philosophical anthropology as a way of working beyond Manichaean binaries on which anthropology has been historically based, towards a more relational understanding of the embodied self and the embodied and studied other. It's also worth mentioning here, I don't know how many of you will be familiar with this stuff, but it's worth mentioning in passing. Many of you will know Raywin Connell's Southern Theory, I guess. The essays of Terry Garuba, and there's a particularly fascinating book from 2012 called Life Worlds. It's a sort of existentialist anthropology by a scholar named Michael Jackson. Yes, that's his name. That's really his name. It's remarkable stuff. So for me, what distinguishes theory from the South from its estimable peers is its philosophical and interdisciplinary reach, the ways in which it shakes its own disciplinary ground in order to pursue what constitutes the philosophical and who constitutes a self-consciously modern subject. I've left theory from the South for last because in many ways it exemplifies both the methods and the contestational spirit of global South studies. In both its theoretical innovations and oppositional stance, theory from the South also approaches the threshold or convergence of questions of intention and method that faces our field as it enters its second decade. For it is a text whose intentions and methods do not always sync, one in which Africa stands as both a modernity unmoored from European models, yet intertwined with them, at once, or sometimes at different points in the same chapter, the same paragraph sometimes, independent from, oppositional to, and imbricated with Western modernity. Depending on which chapter, or even page, one reads, Africa, the signifier itself is Western, is or is not part of the history of Western coloniality, and thus of Western modernity. Theory from the South leans notably for its dual theses on the linguistic play between modernity and modernization. So modernity, they describe as an orientation towards being in the world predicated on, quote, an ideology of improvement through the accumulation of knowledge. So there's modernity. And on the other hand, you have modernization, which to them is a Eurocentric narrative that, quote, posits a strong normative teleology, a unilinear trajectory toward a future capitalist, socialist, fascist, African, whatever, to which all humanity ought to aspire and all things lead, end of quote. It is this unresolved and maybe unresolvable tension between modernity and modernization that primarily drives the Comoros to a dual thesis that similarly stands in tension with itself. And this is out of their introduction, this is out of their chapter 1, Theory from the South. Quote, "It is here that our two theses converge. Here were the first, the ontological claim that Afro-modernity exists sui generis, not as a derivative of the Euro-original, meets the second assertion that in the history of the present, the Global South is running ahead of the Global North, a hyperbolic prefiguration of its future in the making." End quote. This future in the making is the future anterior, the will have been, that informs the book's subtitle, which is How Euro-America, wait, I got lost in here, How Euro-America is Evolving Toward Africa. It is also a fair way to read the book's protagonist, an Africa unfettered from the static binary Hegelian logic that invented it, a dynamic entity progressing in its own modernity through or beyond the historicizing narratives of the North. It is a revisionary work that rewrites old margins as the sites of new frontiers, of new capital and human ontologies, not necessarily rooted in or oriented towards the North. At these frontiers, however, we find that old myths die hard. For after all, the Africa of Theory from the South does not, should not necessarily want to, escape from a cartographic designation rooted in the world historicizing project, or the schema of classifications that first named the Dark Continent, which the Romans named in the 2nd century BCE, or the name by which we still call it today. In other words, much of what makes the Comoros work such an attractive exemplar of Global South studies derives precisely from the contradictory coherence of its epistemology, the intention, again in Said's terms, that informs Africa as an organizing metaphor, implicated in a European legacy of the same dispersed, suppressed knowledges that the book critiques. We can make a similar case for any number of other geographical ends, India, the Caribbean, Latin America, the South. So, the method that emerges from this initial intention, what the Comoros call a grounded theory, informed by, quote, the historically contextualized, problem-driven effort to account for social and cultural facts in the world by recourse to an imaginative, methodological counterpoint between the inductive and the deductive, the concrete and the concept, empirical observation, and critical ideation, end of quote, does and does not resolve the book's defining tension between contestation and intellectual autonomy. Grounded theory in this case also means the dual commitment to contemporary critical theories and to ethnography, what the Comoros elsewhere call their, quote, perennial encounter with the parochial, the intimate, the experienced near, end quote. In this sense, Theory from the South's interdisciplinary lenses allow it to diverge considerably from Prashad's poorer nations in productive ways, revealing lived experiences and cultural formations of resistance well below the level of the commanding heights on which Prashad's work focuses. The Comoros grounded theory methodologically splits the difference, then, between the empirical and the ideational, often within the same analysis. Chapter 2 explores, I'm going to limit myself to 1 or 2 examples here in the interest of time. Chapter 2 explores Western notions of autonomous personhood from an explicitly African perspective, focusing its ethnographic analysis on South Africa's southern Swana population and its theories of the self, which, per the Comoros, compare favorably with those of Durkheim and Judith Butler. Chapter 3 introduces the concept of polyculturalism, a theoretical construct grounded in the social experience of subjects and minority groups that do not identify with the nation-state in which they happen to live. The relevant quotation here is, quote, less a citizen of the polity than a citizen in it, end quote. So later chapters cover a range of topics, memory politics, South Africa's first post-apartheid election in '94, and so on. In each case, Theory from the South's twin theses do methodologically converge and raise compelling questions. How, for example, can we think about South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission without the larger neoliberal context in which it transpired, without, say, considering the role of multinational corporations that colluded with the apartheid regime? How can a study that focuses on a single geographical entity, in this case Africa, deploy methods that can productively maintain a dual focus on people's lived experience and its relations, its mutual entailment, as I put it, with the global north? How to parse these? Should we want to? The book provides no clear answers to these questions, but I would argue that it does plenty by posing them at all. Thus, the friction between its two core arguments, for Africa representing both a modernity unaligned with Europe and one that oppositionally interacts with the history of Euro-coloniality turns out to be very productive, albeit one in which neither thesis is ultimately reducible to the other. So there's much more to these books than I can obviously do in this little sketch, but my larger point, to wrap up here, to return to questions of intention and method, has been to offer some sense of the wealth of methods that are starting to define global South studies. There are, of course, a number of others. For us in this room, that is, I think, both our legacy and our challenge. For ultimately, the problem of an interdisciplinary field is thus the absence, perhaps the impossibility, perhaps not even the desirability of a shared methodology. Instead, a multiplicity of methods, variations on a single intention, perhaps, toward a common end, perhaps. In the case of the Global South, our problem becomes compounded by its relation to fields that are themselves methodological bricollages of distinct originary disciplines, which you could argue are themselves bricolages, but I digress. This realization of the impossibility of thinking in a definitive way about method returns us to the urgency of having to do so, to the imperative, in short, of taking responsibility for what we're starting to call an interdisciplinary field of study. Perhaps the best we can do is to begin to situate the Global South within an intellectual history of studies. So we're thinking here of African American, women's studies, gender studies, Latinx, etc., and so on. Disciplines built on top of existing, themselves invented disciplines. So here you have another layer of the onion, right? Comparative literature, anthropology, history, and so on. And of course, this is in the spirit, I mean, as someone trained in post-structuralist, I tend to think of this in terms of the old Derridian bricolage, right? Which, let us not forget, is a concept that he borrowed from anthropology in a way that Levi-Strauss may or may not, maybe would have liked. Such an approach, one that maintains awareness of the prolixity of intellectual strands from which we are assembling our current project, offers at least a methodological toolkit and perhaps a preliminary canon with which to begin defining the work we do under the banner of the Global South. So, to wrap up, although this has been a lecture on method, on how we do our work, I want to end with a gesture, a reminder, which I imagine will be absolutely redundant, that beyond considerations of methodology and bibliography and citations and so on, lies the understanding, our shared intention, that at the heart of the historicized human agent is a subjectivity knowing itself through its others, by way of a shared sense of what it means to be human. People, as Sartre once wrote, quote, always make something out of what they've been made into, end quote. For me, the Global South has always been about communities violently molded by a history of coloniality and modernity, capitalism and modernization, to understand and learn from the many humanisms and humans that live their lives beyond the grasp and even the interest of conventional Western scientism. One such life that has always stuck with me, and I'm so thrilled to be here, I'm going to go out singing. One such life that has always stuck with me is the nameless character to whom Paul Simon dedicates one of his most memorable songs, The Cool, Cool River. For the mother's restless son, who is a witness to, who is a warrior, who denies his urge to break and run, who says, hard times, I'm used to them. The speeding planet burns, I'm used to that. My life's so common it disappears. But sometimes even music cannot substitute for tears. There's always a danger when I'm in the room that I'm going to break it. Would you like this microphone thing? Okay.
Okay, people can always hear me. It's for the recording.
Oh.
It's on. It's still on, right?
Okay.
Okay. It's absolutely no fear that I'm going to break into song.
Okay.
No, people pay me not to. Okay. So I have a series of comments. I had the privilege of being able to read this a little bit earlier. I think both of us as commentators did. And I'm just going to go through these through my comments, but before I get started on the comments, I just want to acknowledge, in a kind of grounding of where Penn State is, the fact that just south of us was and is the model of the residential school for Indians for the whole of North America at Carlisle. So that's something to bear in mind. The second is that the Drake statue that you were referring to is in Pennsylvania. And that although Center County itself has declared a ban on fracking, not that difficult to do because of the geography under us, the Marcellus Shale makes us part of the fracking crescent. And there's currently a young woman I know who is in a tree declared a terrorist on her own property. If anybody wants to send something to a campaign, please let me know and I'll send you the property. She's defending or trying to stop them putting a pipeline through her property. She's gone from being a property owner to being a terrorist on her own property in the course of just a couple of years. Okay, so to Al's paper. First of all, I want to kind of tease out the tension in the Comoros between a kind of modernity or an Afro-modernity that is in tension with modernization, which acknowledges, according to them, the inheritance of the colonial. I think that this is a really productive tension, but I also worry about the tension. And this is because whenever we go towards a notion of, whenever I try to move towards a notion of a sense of culture that is resilient to or X or out of the colonial, I get accused of being appealing to an exotic, authentic other. So this tension between modernization and modernity is much easier to hold in mindsets that are not so attuned and trained by the notion of a necessary binary. Because, and just to give you a way in which this works, I was in working with a student in English the other day, and we were talking about this, and I said there is a kind of animism that exceeds the Western notions of an anima that fills a material object, you know. And my colleague in English said, yes, but have you seen Nairobi lately? Meaning the extent of the capitalization of Nairobi. See, so it's always, the move is always going to go to capitalism will always win, you know. But what I'm trying to suggest is that when one tries to counter that move completely, one gets accused of a kind of exoticized African authenticity. So I agree with the kind of maintaining that you know, what the Comoros, not necessarily the way they pose it, mind you, but that tension that the Comoros have. I just want to point out that it's very difficult to maintain in the sense of that people will always go to try to collapse that. And so that what happens in that is that we are now moving, I think, towards languages of resilience and resistance and ways of trying to speak about cultures that have been affected by colonialism but not entirely territorialized by them. And that is something that the post-colonial has trouble coming up with a word for. And of course I'm aware of Judith Butler's critique of resilience, especially because although she doesn't acknowledge it, resilience comes out of public health. So she doesn't really address that. But I do want to point out that it's very, once again, that these languages are very difficult to generate because you're immediately accused of you know, an appeal to an impossible, originary, a utopian, etc., which completely writes out the notion of cultural imaginaries for whom the Cartesian subject-object split was never the primary phenomenological crisis, but only inherited through colonialism, which isn't to deny the power of colonialism as I feel might have been done a little extravagantly earlier, but to actually wrestle with these issues. The second point where I sort of just wanted to quibble with Al's language just a little bit is, it's not my point, it's Sarah Briette's point that's been taken up by Alex sitting here in front of us as well, is the idea that neoliberalism stands as a kind of acceptable coinage for the discussion of capitalism.
Yeah, right.
And so I would encourage a moving towards the notion of global capitalisms, because otherwise what happens is we in the academy discuss neoliberalism and nobody knows what the hell we're talking about. Right. And we also inherit the kind of censoring of capitalism that goes on in the US in particular anyway. So it's not surprising to me that Sarah is attached to a Canadian university. Okay. The next point is the notion of the human subject. I'm not sure that the subject in many of the literatures that I study is actually human, in the sense of the subject of human rights, or the human subject as we think of it. So we need to start being able to develop words in English for compound subjects. And I've been wrestling in my book, and I think you've been wrestling in your extractive parameters book, with the notion of subjects that never divided themselves into the human and the non-human animal and the river. So when we're going, we struggle so hard in English, not because, by the way, English originally, or really originally English, did not have a motive for this. You know, if you go back to Old English, you can see the compound subjects par excellence. It's with the Enlightenment and the Cartesian thought that we then get the break in the subject between the subject and the object. But there are many languages that don't incorporate that. So I just want to point out that we need to be careful. It's this trick of how much you acknowledge the subject-object as a problem, but you don't go as far as maybe most new materialists to say this is everybody's problem, right? Because you know what, it ain't. Without an appeal to an authentic original. Okay, so I think, looking at what a methodology of the subject, which is both human and non-human in compound formations, looks like, is something that, that we're behind the 8 ball on in our Global South methodology. Another methodology that I would like to resurrect as a piece is the fact that we are in the minority of thinking of the living and the dead as a binary, but so we need to think, what does the methodology of the unborn, the ancestors, and the living look like? That is a contribution of the Global South and Indigenous, and so this complete and utter reliance on a certain kind of subject-object materiality that has to do with the biologically living and the biologically dead is very overdetermined in our language. That doesn't really speak to the richness of the Global South that we're talking about. What I'm talking about in the book that I'm writing right now, which I'm hoping to finish up soon, as we all are, except for some of us, like Charlotte, who have finished hers, the notion that the nation state is something that we rely on. There are many communities that I work in that have never trusted either the state or the nation to provide them with bloody anything. So I think that we need to think about what identity looks like in places, in localities, in communities where the nation and the state, which are, I agree are different, are foreign. And not only foreign, but the enemy. Okay. I very much enjoyed the discussion of the book on obviously on extractive communities. I'm concerned in our methodologies of the Global South about the location and locus of indigeneity. Okay, so what are the methodologies whereby we look at, for example, Tswana communities? By the way, I have nothing against the Tswana. In fact, when I think of the Comoros, I think lovingly of the fact that South Tswana and South Sotho are closely related. And when you ask somebody in South Sotho and South Tswana, how are you? They can say either I'm okay or I'm fine, or they can say I am still living. So there's a way of thinking about it. So I have nothing against the South Tswana, but the South Tswana have actually perpetrated huge human rights and nature violations against the Khoikhoi in the Botswana area, in Botswana itself. And these have relations to Australian forms of colonization and white settler colonization as well. So looking at non-racialized imaginaries of what you do in the indigenous as an extractive industry where the indigenous relates to indigenous plants as well as indigenous peoples is something that I would want to think about, including black-on-black colonizations. And so that is one area I wanted to just point out as a kind of complement to this methodology. The next methodology that I wanted to point out, which is also somewhat dealt with in our discussion of extractive industries, is my refusal to buy into a cosmopolitan formation for global South studies. That is, what is the place of rurality? After all, Penn State is in a rural area. What is the place of rurality in global South methodologies? And how do we make sure that we're not focusing only on the city and the slum adjacent to the city? Okay. When I think about this, just quickly, I think about doing work in Popo in KwaZulu-Natal, and the Zulu women very anxious about their own pathologization, not them themselves, but, well, it is them themselves, okay, but the whole idea of infant rape, which was taken off in 2003. So this is rape by infant isiZulu children and other black children in South Africa by gangs of men who were unemployed, dispossessed, etc., ranging from 17 to 40 or 50. And the relief they felt when I said to them, when they would say to me, is this the only place this happens in the world? Because they're in the rural areas, they don't get the news, they don't see an international context. And I was able to say, actually, no. Tamil Nadu in South India has also got a number of these cases of infant rape, also in connection with an HIV positive context, and I can talk more about this later. But this incredible isolation of the rural, and what is the ethical question of what is the role of the academic in this South-South mediation in service of that. Of course, I've picked that up with fracking as well in Pennsylvania, along with colleagues who were working on it before I came, so I don't claim to have, I'm just claiming to support that. But I do think it's an ethical question that pertains particularly to the notion of the rural as methodology in global South studies. The last thing I wanted to point to is language. We're operating in English as a lingua franca, but once again, as I pointed out, in relation to Tswana, or in relation to isiZulu, in relation to whatever else we might be talking about, we need to understand that the communities we're talking about have inherited colonial languages to some degree, and I would include, by the way, Kiswahili in that, and obviously Spanish. So this becomes a question of to what extent are we pitching a resistance or some kind of oppositional politics without understanding that, as Marlene Nobies Phillip puts it, English is a foreign anguish. Okay, so those are my sort of supplementary methodological notes.
Hello.
Good afternoon.
Hello.
You're speaking to the lack of air in the room.
I think I just know I'm not like in a black space, because I feel like in black spaces, if you don't, like, it's like, hi.
Yeah.
Anyway. First, let me apologize for missing earlier today. I've been fighting the flu, which I can also hopefully blame for any defects that you find in what I'm about to say. I also want to thank Magali for inviting me to respond to Dr. López's paper and for organizing this conference. Not only has she gotten me out of my office, which as an administrator I rarely leave, but she's also invited me to engage with a field and set of interlocutors that I don't think with very often. Thanks also to Dr. López, whose talk has allowed me to consider anew the scope, place, and epistemological reach of Black studies, and particularly Black American studies. So in what follows, I want to take up Dr. López's injunction to situate Global South studies within African American studies amongst other ethnic studies. And before I begin, I should say, as another little disclaimer, that Global South Studies is not my normal beat. So I would not presume to lecture any of you or Dr. López about the gaps in the field, about the ways in which, methodology needs to be supplemented or not. I think that's for you closer to the field to debate. But I do want to consider why crosstalk between Global South Studies and Black American Studies may not frequently occur, and then what it might yield for thinkers in Global South Studies. So, I begin. In the brilliant album, What's Going On, which was Marvin Gaye's Declaration of Independence from the Motown pop factory that had launched him, Gaye diagnoses, laments, and rails against the world's ills. In one of his lesser-known songs, Save the Children, under a roving bass line and a chorus of strings, Gaye first says, then sings the following, and I will not sing right now. Not because people pay me not to, but because I just won't. There'll come a time when the world won't be singing, flowers won't grow. Who really cares? Who is willing to try to save a world that's destined to die? Unquote. He continues, such a bad way to live. Who is to blame when we can't stop living? Live for life, but let live everybody. So What's Going On is typically thought of as a report from the inner city, a chronicle of how hard life is when you're Black and poor. But that, and I think this is a point that's too often overlooked, it's also, and this is, again, just something that's not emphasized enough, it's a planetary level analysis. It's an album that links together the war in Vietnam, police brutality in Detroit, poverty in Watts, and global warming. So Gaye connects racial capitalism, US empire, and ecological destruction in an album that is called a concept album now. So those entities and the structures and knowledges they have produced, Gaye tells us, are committed to the absolute annihilation of Black ways of thinking, moving, and being in the world. That's what I think he means when he says, who is to blame when we can't stop living, and points us toward a radical politics of equality. Live for life, but let live everybody. The type of global analysis offered by Gaye here is often overlooked or seen as an anomaly, when in reality, I think it represents a dominant strain in Black American thought and culture. And what I want to argue is that the same kind of mistake that people make in terms of thinking about that album is the same mistake that they make in terms of thinking about Black American studies. And so the larger kind of polemical point I'm making is that Black American artists, activists, and thinkers have more often than not provided a situated and historically specific analysis of local and global dynamics, even while their work has been framed as parochial or anti-cosmopolitan. Indeed, many disciplines and thinkers continue to see Black studies as a niche enterprise, a tactic for delegitimizing the field. And I want to say here, I'm not just speaking about conservative or Eurocentric academics. I'm also calling out left academics, Black and brown academics, sometimes even within the field, who conflate the uses to which Black culture is put and critiques of Black culture with Black culture itself, as if they're all the same. So think here of the beef between Paul Gilroy and Fred Moten, sparked by Gilroy's assertion that Black American culture has been fully incorporated into US empire and denuded of any radical or even oppositional potential. Gilroy's recent attack echoes earlier denunciations of Black American studies that I remember from the 1990s, pitting sort of Black British cultural studies against Black American cultural studies. Adherents of this position sort of claim that Black Brits, they were the ones that knew that race was a biological fiction, and they understood diasporic movement and hybridity, while Black Americans essentialized Blackness, we thought it was an object, a thing, and focused on Southern folkways or US civil rights, rather than seeing, in quotes, the bigger picture. At that time, I was a graduate student studying with my teachers, Michael Denning and Hazel Carby, who were both formed in the British cultural studies tradition. So I found this binary both inaccurate and slightly amusing as they were training this whole coterie of folks who were doing Black American studies. It didn't track with my own experience, and it didn't track with the way in which I was trained to approach my work. As Stuart Hall would demonstrate so movingly when writing about his experience as a Jamaican immigrant to London, the identities of marginalized populations are a necessary starting point for analyzing how patterns of domination and exploitation are inevitably linked to national and international arrangements of power and privilege. The people about whom I would write in my dissertation and later my first book, Soul Power, a group I called US Third World Leftists, which admittedly was a clumsy way of naming them, but it was the only way that I could sort of think about get to think about these palpable linkages that they were making between their situations and those of colonized peoples, and then how they were forging these concrete ties between themselves and anti-colonialists in the 1960s and 1970s. Moreover, they were following in the footsteps, this was not like a new thing, right? They were following in the footsteps of thinkers and activists who had been doing so since Africans first landed on US shores. Think here of Ida B. Wells, Frederick Douglass, W.B. Du Bois, all of whom oscillated between the global north and the global south, right? They were situated in both places. The dismissal of Black studies as a vantage point and one much better situated than many others from which to understand the complexity of our current shared precarity is rooted in an anti-Blackness that powerfully shapes thought on every continent, even where Black people predominate. So that brings me to the potential kind of crosstalk that might be productive between Black American studies, Black studies more generally, and Global South studies. So there's sort of three, I guess now it's four points that I want to make. So the first one is thinking about both the concept and the practice of anti-Blackness as a kind of powerful analytic through which to understand global arrangements of globality, sociality, economic exploitation, and cultural hierarchy. So here I'm thinking of the arguments made by Sylvia Wynter and Alex Wigalier about the ways that race and white supremacy parse human differences into these categories of humans, not quite human and inhuman, and actually Rosa's comment about human and non-human is also an interesting kind of addition to that.
The book draws heavily on Sylvia Wynter.
Yeah. There's no thinking the human without race and Blackness as a constitutive element. You could also think of this as what Lisa Lowe in Intimacies of Four Continents calls racial governmentality. Another way. Secondly, an analysis of racial capitalism that explores the full complexity of extractive relations by thinking carefully about relation between indigenous genocide, capitalism, industrialization, and the Atlantic slave trade. And I'm really sorry that I missed the earlier conversation about your book, Maka, because I'm sure, I would have had something more interesting to say than just what I've done. And I think Cedric Robinson, in the kind of resurgence of his work, is a kind of early model for this kind of analysis. Thirdly, Western and non-Western entanglement, which is something that Dr. López mentioned, and the Komarovs are interested in, is a kind of multi-layered process that can't be fully described by recourse to familiar binaries. Western, non-Western, indigenous, settler, black, white. And here I'm thinking again of Sylvia Wynter, C.L.R. James, Frantz Fanon, and the ways in which they elucidate how Western and non-Western epistemologies co-created one another and can't really be parsed apart. I find it very confusing when we try to talk about coloniality as if it wasn't completely formed by the cultures it was encountering. So just a kind of more flexible nimble way of thinking about that perhaps. And this point is sort of linked to the point I just made. The modes of resistance are ways out of our current precarity. And maybe an example here will be useful. So I was recently watching a conversation between Saidiya Hartman and Fred Moten on what they call the black outdoors. And Saidiya was talking about the hold, the place where the enslaved were chained on ships. And then Fred talked about this concept he was calling the outside of the outside. And he talked about this tiny town his mother was born in, 300 people, but then a town even smaller that they would call like out in the country, but then there was like another place that was even smaller and they would just say out from there kind of thing. And the ways in which this kind of perspectival shifting, but also this ability to think about being in two places at once, right? And so the whole not being the only way one could think about what's happening with enslaved subjectivity, is that they're chained there, but that there's all sorts of ways in which they're both in the hold and outside of the hold. And then Fred was talking about this example in Harriet Jacobs, where she's in the crawl space as, again, a place to think about her as being both inside that attic and completely outside of it, right, simultaneously. And so trying to think about the ways in which materiality and even that kind of location can be transcended in all sorts of ways that we don't have a very sophisticated language for thinking about. And here, I guess I want to say that I think that Dr. López is being too generous in his reading of how helpful the Comaroff's frame in Theory from the Global South is for leading Global South studies in new directions. So like a couple things I was thinking about. For example, it's just striking to me the way in which the kind of like usual litany of continental philosophers are kind of thought about, and I never see, you know, Du Bois talked about, or James, or other people who are not part of that lineage, like they're just never there. Or to think about the way in which they sort of very clumsily talk about the US, and then they say, well, of course there are these communities within the US that, you know, have some of the same conditions, but, you know, ... And I think the larger point about that is that the way, and it gets back to this point about, that Winter reminds us of, you know, from the moment of contact, right, there is this inextricable entanglement that's happening that is always disavowed at the same time as it's, you know, cohering. It seems to me that that's similarly true in terms of thinking about certainly the US and the North, and the way in which, so for example, in the introduction to the Theory from the Global South, they talk about comparative modernities, this model in which Africa and the US and the West can be juxtaposed, relying upon this understanding, I think, of the US as a kind of unitary and even you know, distribution of rights and goods, when in fact the modernity of white America, the economic, cultural, social bounty that has characterized most of this country's history, was carved out of a parallel modernity that's endured by black Americans, right? And a modernity defined by enslavement, debt peonage, domestic terrorism, medical abuse and experimentation, and general deprivation, right? So I don't think there's a very coherent or interesting way of thinking about the North and the South as these kind of two binary categories, when you could think about all the ways in which both North and South are happening within the bounded space of one nation state, right? Continuously and constantly. So, black Americans, I think, have never uncomplicatedly thought about themselves as Americans. So for example, like, we are very familiar with the kind of like in space but not of space, precisely because we've never enjoyed the same safety and freedom from violence enjoyed by whites. So what I mean to suggest here is not so much that the North is following the South in this new neoliberal moment, as I think the Comaroffs are arguing. I think it might be more accurate to say that the conditions that currently characterize many, many marginalized communities, black and brown communities, and neo-colonial spaces are now actually being felt ever more urgently by white people in the North, right? So there's actually something, I think, that's a little bit different happening. With that, I will just say thanks very much for the opportunity.
For discussion. Al, I don't know if you want to start by saying a few things as we did in the round table, or we can just open it up.
This will be necessarily very scattered, but I will attempt to do justice to some very useful critiques. And I'm really glad to hear you talk about Fred Munter, who was part of my little PhD committee, and so followed his work for a long time. Anyway, so and these are just going to be bits and pieces that aren't necessarily going to be comprehensive in any way. But I want to touch on the question of the subject is human, the question of the subject, and we've already, there's other work that I've done recently that you're familiar with that addresses this more fully, but I think that the primary, one concern with what I guess, for lack of a better, I'm going to call it a materialist term, one concern with it, and I don't think it's an unfounded one, is the question of whether a materialist reading, one that wants to incorporate a human subject within a larger assemblage environment, in a sort of Deleuzian way, with the human and the non-human, this question of, right, deprivileging a human subject, that kind of discourse runs a certain risk of denying, I'm just going to drop it like this, of denying subjectivity to, frankly, the vast majority of the world's population that has been struggling for centuries to achieve a privileged subjective status, right? Whether we want to critique the buy-in to a neoliberal subject position, that's a different conversation, but the fact that we do have a tradition, and I think of Black American studies is fair game here too, the question of part of, I mean, one of Du Bois's earliest, and I'm going to paraphrase him badly, but the statement of wanting to be permitted to be fellow workers in the project of civilization, right? Like that's a statement of wanting to share in a human subjectivity that a white population, right, enjoys, right? Wanting to enjoy that. And so, when a materialist term, the reason a materialist term wouldn't be attractive, I think, to many people, is the idea that, oh wait, we're not even human yet. We're going to want to give that up already? Wait, no, stop, right? You know, we want a Lexus, we want nice, we want to be privileged. So there's that issue, and I think Alex Wahelia's, wow, astonishing, wonderful book, Habeas Viscus, and he's gotten me back into reading Sylvia Wynter, who I'd read in a long time, but Wahelia's book threads the needle in a very useful way between the materialist term and not clinging to a human subject, but maintaining the demand for I don't know, an entity that we foreclose on and call it a subject, but that there's an agentic presence there that doesn't go away. So I think that's a useful, I don't know, for me, useful way of thinking about it. I wonder, Cynthia, how much, and this is, I guess, my other question. It's more of a question than anything else. This is the one quote that jumped out at me. I wrote it down: dismissal of Black studies as a vantage point. How much of this is Bell? And I'm thinking here of Bell Hooks, right, as an example, somebody who already saw, with the rise of high theory or whatever in the 80s, that there were subjects who were being spoken about, so Black Americans, those Asians who were not part of the academy, who were being talked about, but not necessarily allowed to speak. And so I think about her possible relevance. That's a book I want to go back and pick up again. Then I think another question for me would be that I think you're right that there's a sort of mutual blind spot between American studies, which is interested in race but doesn't see its own colonial sort of impulses, and postcolonialism, which is all about analyzing colonial impulses but doesn't see race as fully, I want to say, as American studies has. And I'll just stop there before I get into trouble. Yeah. Okay.